It's easy to walk past someone who seems invisible, to dismiss their quiet struggles or worn-out exterior. But sometimes all it takes is one person to see beyond the surface and offer a simple act of kindness that can change everything. Clara Jensen didn't expect anything more than to serve a warm meal about a lonely old man sitting across from her diner. But when she did, she unknowingly set off a chain of events that would shake the very ground beneath Flagstaff, Arizona. A small act of dignity, a plate of meatloaf and a muffin, would soon reveal a hero hidden behind the faded fabric of a war jacket and change the lives of everyone in town. What happens when we choose to see the person, not just the circumstances? What happens when kindness meets respect in a world that often forgets both? This story isn't just about one man's past. It's about the legacy of dignity that still calls us to act every day in the quietest of moments. Clara Jensen didn't flinch. She didn't even blink when she heard the sneering words aimed at Walter, the quiet man who had been sitting across the street 4 months, watching the world pass by from his perch outside the old post office. The man who never spoke, never asked for anything. He just observed. The question hung in the air like smoke. Why are you serving that filthy old man? He looks like he crawled out of a dumpster. The man who spoke, sitting at the center table in his crisp shirt and gleaming watch, clearly thought he had the right to judge. But Clara had heard this kind of thing before. It wasn't new, not to her, and certainly not to someone who knew what it was like to struggle for dignity. Without a word, Clara did what she always did. She moved to the kitchen and came back with a plate, a generous serving of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and a muffin, warm from the oven, fresh and filled with care. It wasn't just food, it was an offering of respect. She placed the plate in front of Walter, her hand steady. She didn't look at the businessman, didn't even acknowledge him as he grumbled to himself. "It's on the house," Clara said, her voice low but firm. Walter, for his part, didn't say anything, his eyes still focused on the table in front of him, as if he didn't want to draw attention. But Clara saw it, the flicker of something in his tired eyes that spoke volume, gratitude maybe. Or perhaps it was just a reminder that someone still saw him, that someone still cared. The businessman was not pleased. He scoffed, rolling his eyes with an exaggerated display of contempt. "What is this?" he sneered. "A charity kitchen?" He glanced at his companions, looking for them to join in, but no one did. The other diners seemed uncomfortable, but no one said a word. "Some of us actually work for a living," the man muttered, and Clara couldn't help but feel the weight of his scorn, heavy and uninvited. But she didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Instead, Clara's response was simple, quiet, and unwavering. "Because dignity," she said softly as if speaking to the whole room, "isn't something you earn with a paycheck." The man didn't respond. Instead, he stood up, throwing a few bills on the table, and stormed out of the diner, leaving behind a cloud of mockery. But Clara stood tall, watching as he disappeared into the fading sunlight outside. It was hours later, long after the lunch crowd had come and gone, when the ground shook. At first, Clara thought it was just another tremor, nothing out of the ordinary in Flagstaff, Arizona. But then the sound of a helicopter grew louder, and soon the unmistakable thud of a Black Hawk's rotor blades filled the air. The helicopter landed just behind her diner, sending a small dust cloud into the air. Clara stepped back from the window, trying to make sense of what was happening. She never expected this. A man stepped out of the helicopter, tall, proud, and wearing a uniform. A general. Not someone she had ever met, but someone with a presence that made the entire diner go still. "Clara Jensen?" the general asked, his voice carrying a weight that made her heart race. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The general nodded, his expression serious. "Thank you for what you did today, for your kindness." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected anyone to thank her. Not for this, not for giving Walter a free meal, but the general wasn't done. "You see," he continued, his voice thick with emotion, "that man you served, he's a war hero, a decorated one, and he's been hiding in plain sight for years because he didn't want anyone to know." Clara blinked, trying to process the words. The man who had sat across from her every day, the one who had never asked for a thing, wasn't just a regular old man. He was someone important, Someone who had sacrificed for his country, and yet here he was, barely seen, barely acknowledged by the world. The general's next words left her speechless. He saved lives, Clara. And what you did today, it mattered, more than you know. The whole diner was silent, the weight of the moment sinking in. Clara felt as if the world had shifted beneath her feet. She looked out the window, toward the same bench where Walter had sat day after day, and for the first time she realized just how deeply people can hide, how much can be lost in the silence of everyday life. And yet, somehow in that small, quiet diner, in that one simple act of defiance, the world had been reminded of something important. That dignity isn't something you earn with money. It's something you give freely, something you recognize in others, no matter who they are. In Flagstaff, Arizona, a place where stories gather in the corners of diners more than they do in newspapers, Clara's simple act of kindness would be the one story people would tell for years to come. Clara's companions looked on, their faces a mix of embarrassment and disbelief. One of them, after a long moment, left a large tip behind. Walter, still in shock, glanced down at the meal, the plate of food untouched, except for the faint tremor in his hands. "You didn't have to do that," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I know how I look." Clara's eyes met his with a quiet steadiness. Everyone deserves a warm meal and a little respect. Walter didn't finish the meal. Instead, he carefully wrapped the muffin in a napkin and tucked it away, his hands slow and deliberate. Before he left, he placed a single quarter on the table. Maybe all he had left. Clara, after a moment of hesitation, picked it up. She held it in her palm for a few beats, as though it was something sacred, something important. For reasons she couldn't explain, she kept it. What neither she nor anyone else in that diner knew was the truth hidden beneath Walter's worn jacket and lowered gaze. Behind the fragile exterior was a war hero, a man whose honor was not immediately visible to the unknowing, and by nightfall the sky above would tremble in his honor. That night, Walter Graham didn't sleep well. In fact, he never did. Not for decades. Not since the jungles of Vietnam. Not since the day he'd been working on a CH-47 helicopter, piecing it together with whatever parts he could scavenge in a prayer, only for the rotor to fail. Even now at 85, sleep was elusive, coming in fits and bursts, with memories flashing before his eyes like a flickering film reel. These memories were his alone, invisible to anyone else. He woke in his small, one-bedroom apartment above a shuttered print shop on East Walnut. The ceiling fan clicked, its rotation uneven. A coffee can sat on the windowsill, holding the quarters he used for laundry. His morning routine was slow and deliberate, as always. Boiling water, oatmeal too heavy with cinnamon, a few stretches for his stiff, aching joints. His knees never quite loosened, no matter how many times he tried. But that morning was different. Not the world outside. That stayed the same. It was something inside him. For the first time in a long time, someone had seen him. Not for what he lacked, not for the things the world assumed about him, but for what he carried. That simple act of kindness in the diner hadn't been expected, but it had been felt deep within. He hadn't asked for it. In fact, for most of his life, Walt had done everything in his power to avoid attention. He'd learned early to stay quiet, to remain in the shadows, especially in a world that moved too fast to remember anything that didn't fit into a tweet or headline. But beneath his faded olive jacket, beneath the hunched shoulders and the eyes that never met anyone's gaze for too long, there was a story no one had ever bothered to ask about. And even if they had, he wouldn't have known how to tell it. Walt Graham had been born in 1938, just before war began to sweep across the globe. By the time he was 7, his father had gone off to fight in Europe and never returned. His mother, a woman of grit and perseverance, raised him and his 2 sisters. She believed firmly that men had to earn respect, not demand it. When Walt turned 19, he enlisted in the U.S. Air Force. It wasn't for adventure, and it wasn't even for patriotism. It was for structure, for the chance to work with machines he had only seen in the pages of popular mechanics. Aircraft made sense to him, but people didn't. He showed an aptitude for maintenance almost immediately, and the older crew chiefs started calling him the Whisperer because he could diagnose an engine problem by simply listening to the hum of the machine from 30 feet away. When the Vietnam War escalated, Walt was deployed to a base near Pleiku, deep in the Central Highlands. He served 3 tours, but not as a pilot or a commander. No, Walt was just a mechanic, a quiet presence in coveralls, his grease pencil always behind his ear, with lungs full of jet fuel and hands stained from years of work. But the stories people never heard weren't about the things he fixed. They were about the risks he took. In the summer of 1969, a Chinook helicopter came in hard. The hydraulics were damaged, crosswinds were strong, and the tail rotor had failed. It crashed on landing, exploding into a fireball. Most of the men around him ran. Walt didn't. He ran the other way, straight into the flames. One by one, he pulled out 9 crew members. Each one heavier than the last, his arms burned and blistered with each pull. After the last soldier was dragged to safety, Walt collapsed. For that act, he was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, one of the highest honors a member of the U.S. Air Force could receive for non-combat service. He didn't attend the ceremony. "Those boys flew into fire," he said to his commanding officer. "I just fixed the birds." After Vietnam, Walt continued serving, training young airmen, writing repair protocols that would later become part of official Air Force doctrine. He turned down promotions, never married, and whenever someone asked him why, he always gave the same answer: "I'm already married to those birds." In 1900, after 26 years of service, he retired and moved to Arizona. He opened a small repair shop where he worked on old Buicks and busted microwaves. He taught neighborhood kids how to change oil and patch flat tires, never charging single mothers or veterans a dime if he could help it. But the years weren't kind to him. Agent Orange exposure, arthritis, and eventually Parkinson's disease took their toll. The slow unraveling of the hands that had once rebuilt turbine engines by feel in the dark was painful to watch. The shop closed. His pension barely covered rent. His friends either died or drifted away, and Walt became like so many other veterans, forgotten, invisible. He still wore his old jacket, not because he clung to the past, but because it was warm. Its deep pockets were practical, and the lining reminded him of the base hangar in Da Nang. That's what Clara saw. Not a vagrant, but a man draped in the weight of decades of service and silence. She hadn't asked his name that day, but somehow she knew who he was. Back in the diner, the plate of meatloaf stayed with him. Not because of the taste or the muffin, but because of what it meant. For the first time in years, someone had looked him in the eyes without pity, without judgment, just respect. The kind of respect no medal could give, no paycheck could buy. That night, for reasons Walt didn't quite understand, he dug through an old tin in his closet. Inside, neatly folded, were pieces of his life, discharge papers, a faded photo of his unit, and a rusted piece of metal. Half of the Distinguished Flying Cross pin that had broken in a move years ago. He made a call, not to not to a hotline, but to an old friend, a name he hadn't dialed in over 30 years, Major General Marcus Lang, the son of a pilot Walt had once carried out of a burning helicopter. What Walt said to him wasn't dramatic, just 8 simple words. "Someone was kind to me today." That was all. By 8:45 p.m., Clara was alone in the diner. The dinner rush had passed, leaving the red booths empty. The lights dimmed slightly, and the radio hummed a soft tune from a distant decade. Clara wiped down the counters, her body tired but her mind restless. Something about Walt lingered in her thoughts. His quiet thank you, the way he tucked part of the sandwich into his pocket like it was a treasure, and the single quarter he left behind, now resting in the tip jar. It wasn't just money, it was a symbol. She couldn't bring herself to throw it out. Then a low hum broke the silence. It started soft, like a distant freight train or the rumble of approaching thunder. Clara barely glanced up at first, but it grew louder, stronger. The windows rattled in their frames and the plates on the drying rack trembled. The overhead lights flickered. She stepped outside, dish towel still in hand. What she saw made her heart stop. A Black Hawk helicopter, sleek, powerful, military grade, was descending behind the diner. The helicopter roared into the empty lot, its rotors stirring up a furious storm of gravel and dust. The sky was filled with the violent hum of artificial wind. Napkins flew off tables inside the diner, tumbling wildly through the air. The back door slammed shut with a jarring force, as if the building itself was trying to escape the commotion. Clara shielded her eyes, her arm held up against the onslaught, Blinking through the swirling dust and debris, a thought flickered in her mind. This has to be a mistake. Maybe a medevac, some kind of emergency. But the helicopter didn't speed past. It settled, coming down with a heavy thud, and the rotors gradually began to slow. The side door of the chopper slid open. Two soldiers stepped out first, their fatigues blending with the dust, their movements calm and measured as they surveyed the area. Then from the heart of the machine, a tall man emerged in a formal dress uniform. His chest was decorated with rows of medals, and his shoulders were squared beneath the gleaming stars of a brigadier general. He walked straight towards her, his eyes fixed, purposeful. "Miss Jensen," he called over the still turning blades. Clara froze, unsure of what was happening. Was this a mistake? Was she in trouble? Or was she caught in some strange dream? The general stepped closer, his voice cutting through the whirl of noise. "I apologize for the unannounced landing," he said, stopping just a few feet away from her. "But when a man like Walt Graham tells you someone showed him kindness, you don't wait until morning." Clara blinked, her confusion mounting. "Wait, what?" The general's tone softened, losing its military sharpness and taking on something more personal, more human. "In 1960, Walt Graham pulled my father out of a burning helicopter, saved his life. My father never forgot it. Neither did I." He paused, as if reliving the moment himself. "Walt called me tonight just to say that someone treated him decently for the first time in years. He didn't ask for anything, didn't want attention. But some debts can't be ignored." Behind him, Clara noticed a military Humvee slowly approaching, flanked by a local police cruiser, its lights dimmed in respect. As the Humvee rolled to a stop, the passenger side door opened, and out stepped Walt Graham, but not the man she had seen earlier that afternoon. This Walt stood taller, his eyes clearer, his posture proud. Gone was the faded jacket, replaced by a formal Air Force dress uniform. The polished metals gleamed under the diner's flickering neon glow. The man before her now looked like someone who had faced down storms and emerged unscathed. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She covered her mouth, overwhelmed. Walt didn't speak at first. He simply walked slowly to the corner booth, the same one where he had sat in silence just hours before. He placed his hand on the tabletop. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. The general turned to face the small gathering of onlookers, many of whom had come out of their homes in their robes and slippers. Some of the children were still holding their phones, filming the scene. A local news van had just pulled up at the edge of the lot. "Ladies and gentlemen," the general began, his voice steady, "it is my honor to recognize Technical Sergeant Walter Graham, United States Air Force, recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Bronze Star, a man whose hands once rebuilt flight and whose silence hid heroism." As the general spoke, applause broke out, followed by salutes, and soon, the quiet of the evening was filled with tears. Clara stood still, feeling the weight of it all. Overwhelmed, surprised, moved. "Miss Jensen," the general added, turning back to her, "you reminded us what respect looks like in action, not just words. And on behalf of every uniform Walt ever helped send safely home, thank you." One of the soldiers stepped forward and handed Clara a letter, its seals embossed with the weight of authority, signed by several officers. A formal commendation. Clara felt her mouth go dry, unsure of how to respond. Walt finally spoke, his voice gravelly but firm. "Told them not to make a fuss," he said, managing a smile, though his eyes were still filled with a quiet gratitude. Soldiers were never particularly good at taking orders from mechanics. A ripple of laughter echoed through the crowd. Beneath the vast desert sky, where the steady hum of the rotor blades filled the air, the ground didn't just shake with the roar of engines. It trembled with something deeper, something older. A community awakening, remembering something it had nearly forgotten. Walt stood beneath the flickering sign of the diner, his shoulders square, his posture betraying the years. Time had worn away the fullness of his frame, but he didn't let that matter now. Tonight, the moment should have made him uncomfortable. He loathed attention, avoided cameras as if they were a sickness, yet tonight he stood still, allowing it all to unfold around him. For once, he was being seen, truly seen, and maybe just this once that was okay. The crowd grew steadily as word spread. Some trickled in, still in their night clothes, rubbing sleep from their eyes. Others arrived straight from work, dressed in uniforms, dusty boots, scrubs, or aprons. A few of the local veterans recognized the distinguished flying cross pinned to Walt's coat. They stood a little straighter, their bodies moving in that old, reflexive salute. Walt responded to each with humble dignity, his nods understated but filled with quiet respect. Clara Jensen stood beside him, still clutching the letter of commendation the general had handed her. She hadn't read it yet. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear or confusion, but from the weight of it all. The man she'd once served a sandwich to, a man she never expected to be anything more than another customer, was now surrounded by officers, veterans, townspeople, and the steady hum of a Black Hawk helicopter parked just beyond the gravel lot. The surrealism of it all was almost too much to process. General Lang stepped forward again, this time with a gentler demeanor. He wasn't a commander here, he was a son. My father spoke about Walter Graham the way people speak about legends. He addressed the crowd, his voice steady, filled with a quiet reverence. But Walt never wanted credit. He always said he just fixed things. Well, he fixed my father's fate, and in doing so, he fixed mine too. He turned to face Walt directly. Sir, this is long overdue. We can't change the years you were forgotten, but we can make sure this night is remembered. The applause that followed was loud, heartfelt, echoing in the small town. Someone had brought out an American flag. A couple of high school students, neighbors who lived just down the street, had begun streaming the event on social media. By the morning, that video, uploaded under the hashtag #RememberWalt, would have 1.4 million views. Inside the diner, Clara was busy. She poured coffee for a few officers and neighbors. No one paid for anything, and she wouldn't have let them if they tried. The plates of food came out fast, the hands moving on their own as her mind tried to catch up. Walt had returned to his booth, but this time he wasn't alone. One by one, people came and sat with him, some simply to shake his hand, others to leave notes or tokens of appreciation. A young boy handed him a baseball card. An older woman offered him a photo of her late husband, who'd served in Da Nang. Walt held the photo for a long moment, his voice soft as he spoke. We were probably on the same airstrip, he said. Different jobs, same son. General Lang approached Clara again, this time without the formality. May I ask how you knew? He asked, his voice gentle yet curious. Clara shook her head. I didn't, she said. Not really. I just saw someone who looked like he could use a meal. The general smiled. That's all it takes sometimes, he said, nodding in approval. With one final respectful gesture, the general turned to leave. The helicopter would lift off soon, but before he reached the door, Clara called out to him. General? He turned back toward her. How did he reach you so fast? She asked, her voice filled with genuine curiosity. The general chuckled, his expression lightening for a moment. He called my father, he said. First time in 20 years. Told him. Clara stood silently as the engines of the Black Hawk helicopter roared to life again, its blades slicing through the dark sky. The town, a small and quiet place, held its breath. There was no music, no cheering, no grand gestures. Just the hum of engines and the weight of something far deeper than anyone expected. The only sound that pierced the silence was the distant thrum of the helicopter's retreat, a symbol of the quiet reverence that had unfolded. Her father had cried when he heard. After years of carrying the burden of his own silent service, someone had treated him with the respect he deserved. The tears were not of sorrow, but of gratitude. Then, as if passing on that unspoken message, he called Clara and told her it was time someone returned the favor. She didn't know what to say. She simply nodded, knowing that this wasn't just about her father, but about something larger, something that the world was about to notice. In the days that followed, the story spread like wildfire. The video of the event had gone viral, starting with local news stations, then quickly reaching national outlets. One headline read, "A meal for a hero." Another declared 8 ears and a muffin that moved the military. Veterans groups all over the country began to share their own stories. Stories of forgotten service and unseen wounds that had never been acknowledged. Clara's diner, once just a small-town eatery, became a quiet symbol of something more. a quiet act of kindness that transcended its humble origins. The kind of recognition that wasn't wrapped in ceremony or stripes, but in something far more human. It was the kind of recognition that came from eye contact, warmth, and the simple dignity of one person acknowledging another's worth. Clara placed Walt's quarter, the one he'd left behind after his first meal, inside a small shadow box on the diner wall. Next to it was a printed copy of the commendation letter, and above that a hand-painted wooden sign read, "Dignity served here." Walt came in more often after that, still quiet, still humble, but now he had a place. Not just a seat in the diner, but a presence. When he walked through the door, conversations didn't stop out of discomfort anymore. They paused, out of respect. The shift was subtle but powerful. Clara kept doing what she had always done. Coffee, meatloaf, listening without asking too much. But the atmosphere had changed. Something had shifted. A single act of kindness had rippled outward in ways Clara had never imagined. And in doing so, it brought recognition to Walt that had been long overdue. It was a recognition that came not from applause or celebration, but from the quiet acknowledgement of what had been given. By the next morning, the video had already passed 1 million views. It was raw, shot with a shaky iPhone, but it captured something real. It showed the moment a Black Hawk helicopter touched down behind Clara's diner in Flagstaff, Arizona. It wasn't for combat or ceremony. It was to thank a waitress who had given a simple meal to an old man who had once served his country. And then the camera turned to reveal that old man, thin, bent, his clothes frayed from years of wear. But there he stood, now tall in his full Air Force dress uniform, saluting the crowd with the calm dignity of a man who had faced fire and never once asked to be thanked for it. The internet had seen countless videos, but none like this. The footage hit something deep inside people. It was raw, real, and it resonated with a deep, universal truth. The hashtag #RememberWalt began trending on Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok. People from every corner of the country shared their own stories of grandfathers who had served, veterans who had been forgotten, and the small acts of kindness that had changed everything. News outlets scrambled to cover the story. "An $8 meal that stirred the nation," read one headline. "The waitress who saluted with a fork," said another. Clara didn't know how to respond to all the attention. She turned down every interview request. "I just fed a man who looked hungry," she said to the first reporter who called. "I didn't think it would shake the sky, but it did." Donations started rolling in. At first, they were small amounts, $5, $10, $20. Some came from people who had never even been to Arizona. Many came with heartfelt notes. "This is for the next Walt who walks through your door," one read. "To the man my dad could have been. Thank you for reminding us what honor looks like." With help from a local veterans organization, Clara used the donations to create a formal program called Walt's Table. The concept was simple. One table in the diner would always be open for a veteran. Any veteran, no questions, no strings attached. Just a seat and a meal for those who had given so much and been forgotten for too long. In the small diner, a simple yet powerful tribute was quietly taking shape. Clara had placed a plaque beside the booth, one that honored the quiet courage and open hearts of those who had served. It was a small gesture, but it quickly became something much more. Every day, the booth was filled with older men, their hats worn and faded, women who had served in logistics or medical units, and veterans from all walks of life. Some came alone, their faces solemn. Others brought photos, memories etched in each fragile image. Some came with nothing but their silence, but Clara made sure to greet them all the same. Every morning she poured them a cup of black coffee, just as she had for Walt, and offered them the warmth of her smile. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, the diner transformed. It was no longer just a place for food. It became a sanctuary, a space where veterans could gather, swapping stories, navigating the often overwhelming VA paperwork, or simply sharing the quiet understanding that comes from shared experiences. And Walt, he kept coming. Not every day, but often enough for people to take notice. He'd arrive early, read the paper, and linger long after the lunch crowd had left. People still asked for photos. Sometimes he obliged. Other times, he simply waved them off with a smile and said, "I'm just here for the pie." But one afternoon, something unexpected happened. The businessman, the one who had insulted Walt just days before, walked back into the diner. This time, however, he wasn't alone. He had his young son with him, no older than 10, dressed in a school polo and holding a small American flag. The man approached Clara first. His face was flushed, but his voice was steady as he spoke. "I came to say I was wrong." He turned to Walt, who was sitting at his usual booth, coffee in hand, a slice of lemon pie before him. "Sir, I disrespected you. I didn't know who you were. I didn't know what you had done, and I'm not proud of what I showed my boy that day." The diner fell silent. Walt sat still, looking at him for a long moment, then shifted his gaze to the boy. "You didn't have to come," Walt said quietly, but the man looked at his son, his expression softening. "I did," he replied. "I want my son to learn that real men admit when they're wrong, and that respect isn't earned by money." With that, Walt extended a hand across the table, and the man shook it, his grip firm but filled with regret. There were no more words between them, only a brief but meaningful exchange of understanding. The boy then handed Walt the flag. Walt took it gently, folding it with care, and placed it beside the quarter that had once sat on the table. In the months that followed, Walt's table became a symbol of something more. It sparked a quiet movement that spread to diners and cafes across the state. Some offered discounts to veterans, while others hung simple signs that read, "You are seen, you are welcome." The movement wasn't loud, nor was it fueled by corporations or flashy campaigns. It was built on something much simpler: human decency. And while the world moved on to the next trending story, that small corner of Flagstaff quietly continued its revolution. One cup of coffee, one plate of meatloaf, one hand extended across a table at a time. In that small act of defiance, offering dignity when no one else did, Clara reminded the world that some ripples never fade. A week after the helicopter had landed behind the diner, Clara hung a shadow box on the wall. It was small, just enough to hold a few things that mattered. Inside, there was Walt's distinguished flying cross, now carefully repaired and polished, his quarter, the small American flag the boy had handed him, and a photograph of Walt sitting at his booth, a faint smile on his face, a cup of coffee in hand. Above the display, in quiet script, a wooden sign read, "Legacy isn't loud." People came from near and far just to see it. Some left notes tucked under the frame. Others left unit patches, challenge coins, or simply a quiet moment of respect. They had little mementos of their own family service. One child, a small one, drew a crayon picture of Walt sitting next to a fighter jet, grinning beneath a bright blue sky. Walt never asked for any of it. Honestly, it embarrassed him a bit. But still, he came. Quietly, without fuss, he slid into his usual booth as though nothing had shifted. But something had. Veterans from neighboring towns began showing up. Some traveled hours just to take a seat at Walt's table. They didn't come for applause nor for recognition. They came because, for the first time in years, someone had made space for them. They shared stories over slices of pea and steaming cups of coffee. Some laughed, some cried, others sat silently, their eyes distant, lost in their thoughts. They weren't looking for fame. They just needed a place where they could be heard. It wasn't long before the local schools took notice. A high school history teacher contacted Clara, asking if students could start interviewing veterans at the diner for a class project they were calling Voices We Almost Lost. Clara didn't hesitate. Without giving it a second thought, she cleared a corner near the window, added a few chairs, and left a notepad and recorder in a box labeled "Stories Worth Keeping." Walt was the first to be interviewed. It took a little coaxing. He wasn't a man for long speeches, but once he started, the words kept coming. He didn't talk about medals or heroics. Instead, he spoke of broken engines, the acrid scent of jet fuel, the names of friends who never made it back, and the sharp clinking sound of a wrench hitting the hangar floor in the dead of night. "You don't always know the moment that changes you," he told a nervous teenager clutching a spiral notebook. "Sometimes you only recognize it when you look back, sitting in a place like this, over a cup of coffee." Clara watched it all unfold, quietly amazed. None of this was part of her plan. She didn't set out to change lives. She just did what her grandfather had told her so many years ago: feed people, look them in the eyes, let them know they matter. Now she wiped down the same tables, filled the same coffee pots, and listened to the familiar creak of the door every time it opened. Yet everything felt different, fuller, more sacred. Sometimes when she was pressed for a quote by a local reporter, she'd tell them, "We never know what battle someone fought before sitting at our table." That line, honest and raw, made its way onto bumper stickers and eventually a mural downtown. But Clara didn't say it for the attention. She said it because it was true. One evening, just before closing, Clara was behind the counter, wiping down a coffee cup. Walt sat in his booth, his hands wrapped around a mug half full. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The radio hummed softly in the background, the only sound breaking the silence. A breeze stirred the edge of the napkin dispenser. Outside, the streetlights flickered on as dusk stretched long shadows across the sidewalk. It was just another night, the kind that had become familiar. Yet somehow, everything about this one felt complete. Walt finished his coffee, took a final sip, and placed the mug gently on the table. Clara nodded at him, silent but understanding, as she flicked off the neon sign. And out there, beyond the walls of that small diner, the world kept turning, faster, louder, and ever more distracted than before, but not here. Not in that corner booth, beside a coffee-stained counter. Here, dignity had found a home. Now we ask you, would you have done the same? Would you have seen the person behind the jacket, or would you have walked by? The choice, it seems, still waits at every table. In today's fast-paced world, it's easy to overlook the quiet ones, the ones with worn jackets and trembling hands. We pass them by every day, rarely stopping. What if, behind one of those weary faces, there was a story like Walt's, a life of service, of silent sacrifices, battles fought quietly so that the rest of us could live in peace? Clara, without needing a headline or a medal, recognized the humanity in him. She didn't need any formal recognition to understand the weight of a soul. All it took was compassion, a hot meal, a soft word, a moment of dignity. That's the lesson we carry with us. Kindness doesn't require permission. Respect isn't earned through titles, but through truth, humility, and a recognition of history. So we ask you, have you ever met someone like Walt? Have you ever turned your eyes away when maybe you should have leaned in? We want to hear your stories, the moments of grace, of regret, of quiet courage. This shouldn't just be a video. Let it be a conversation, stretching across generations. Thank you for sharing this moment with us. If it moved you, please like, subscribe, and help us spread more stories that remind the world what respect truly means. Because sometimes a simple cup of coffee carries an entire legacy.